What does it take for a person to simply vanish? Not into thin air, but into the fog of unanswered questions? What happens when the people left behind have to live with nothing but theories, fragments, and a silence that seems to grow heavier with every passing year? The case of Frances Kelly is one of those stories. It's not just about a life lost. It's about a life interrupted. A story where every detail seems to pull you closer, only for the truth to slip further away. Francis wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a figure the world knew until the night he disappeared under circumstances so strange, so unsettling, that they left his friends, his family, and eventually the public grasping for answers. His case, while not as widely covered as others, has persisted in the minds of those who know it. And for good reason. On an otherwise ordinary evening, Francis stepped into the quiet darkness of a night that should have ended with him safely at home. But it didn't. Instead, he walked straight into a chain of events that would puzzle investigators for decades. No one could have predicted what would follow. The sudden disappearance, the scattered fragments of evidence, the rumors that blurred fact and fiction. This isn't a case of a clear suspect caught on camera. There were no dramatic confessions or perfect alibis. Instead, what you'll find here is an unsettling puzzle, one where every piece raises more questions than it answers. Was Francis running from something? Did he stumble into danger by pure chance? Or was there something much darker at work, something still hiding in the shadows? We'll walk through this case together, the life Francis lived before that night, the events leading up to his disappearance, the investigation that followed, and the theories that still linger. Along the way, we'll explore the frustration of a trail that seemed to grow colder the harder people tried to follow it. And through it all, one thing remains. Frances Kelly's story is still unsolved. The mystery still hangs in the air, and somewhere the truth is waiting, perhaps hidden in plain sight or buried deep enough that it may never be found. So, let's step into the quiet streets of the past. Let's retrace the moments before it all went wrong. Because until someone finds the missing pieces, the question will always remain: what really happened to Francis Kelly? Before he became the subject of headlines and whispered speculation, Francis Kelly was, by most accounts, a man living a simple, steady life. There was nothing in his day-to-day existence that hinted at the storm that was coming. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't embroiled in any public scandal, and he certainly wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to find at the center of a mystery. Francis was 42 years old when he vanished, born and raised in a quiet Midwestern town. He grew up in a place where doors were often left unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. His parents, Margaret and Thomas Kelly, were the kind of people who believed in hard work and keeping your word. Francis inherited both qualities. By trade, he was a skilled carpenter, the kind of craftsman who didn't just measure and cut wood. He treated each project as if it had a story of its own. Friends would later recall how he could run his hands over a finished table or chair and tell you exactly which piece of timber had been the most stubborn, and how he'd finally coaxed it into place. His work wasn't just functional. It carried a quiet beauty that seemed to reflect the man himself. Outside of work, Francis lived modestly. He rented a small one-bedroom apartment above a bookstore, a place filled with the faint scent of old paper and the quiet hum of ceiling fans. His life wasn't glamorous, but it was full in its own way. He read often, history, biographies, and the occasional crime novel, and he spent his evenings either in the local pub, chatting with the regulars, or walking along the river that wound its way through town. He wasn't married, but that didn't mean he was alone. His circle of friends was small but tight-knit, a group that had known each other since high school. They described him as dependable, the person you called when you needed help moving furniture, fixing a fence, or just sitting quietly over a beer when life was too much. He didn't have children of his own, But he was Uncle Frank to his nieces and nephews, always showing up with handmade toys or wooden puzzles he'd crafted in his workshop. Francis was also close to his younger sister Ellen. She often said he had a way of making people feel safe, like nothing bad could happen when he was around. That quality made his disappearance all the more difficult to accept. People who knew Francis couldn't reconcile the man they loved with the image of someone who could simply vanish. He had routines, too, small markers of stability. Every morning he stopped by the same coffee shop, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, 2 sugars. He bought his groceries on Thursdays after work. On Sundays, he visited his parents. For dinner, bringing along whatever small project he'd been working on to show them. There were no signs of trouble in his life. No sudden bets, no strange new friends, no hints of conflict that might have pushed him toward danger. If anything, Francis was in a good place. His carpentry business had been steady. He'd just finished a large order for a local inn, and he was talking about taking a short trip later that year to visit a friend out west. But Francis wasn't without a few quirks. He was a private person. In some ways, open and friendly in conversation, but careful about revealing too much of his inner life. If something was bothering him, he rarely said it outright. Instead, he'd work longer hours, lose himself in shaping wood and sanding edges until whatever weighed on him felt lighter. And yet there was nothing, at least nothing obvious. That suggested he was hiding something significant. His friends and family were unanimous on that point. Francis Kelly was grounded, content, and rooted in his community. Which is why what happened next was so bewildering. In the weeks before his disappearance, those closest to him didn't notice any drastic changes. Maybe he seemed a little quieter, a little more thoughtful, but that wasn't unusual for him. A few friends would later mention that he'd taken more walks than usual in the evenings, but no one thought much of it at the time. Looking back, it's easy to search for meaning in those small shifts. Were they signs? Or just the ordinary fluctuations of a person's mood? That's the thing about hindsight. It can make the ordinary seem like a warning, even when it wasn't. Francis's life, at least on the surface, was the picture of stability. And yet, in a matter of hours, that stability would shatter completely. His routines, his relationships, his unfinished projects, all of it would be left behind, frozen. In time, as if waiting for him to walk back through the door. But he never did. And that's where the mystery truly begins, with a man whose life seemed steady, secure, and free of danger, stepping unknowingly toward the night that would erase him from it. It was Sunday, March 14th, 1999, a day that began like countless others in Francis Kelly's quiet routine. It was the kind of early spring morning when the air still held a trace of winter's chill, and the streets were damp from an overnight drizzle. Nothing in those early hours suggested that by nightfall, Francis Kelly would be gone. 7:15 a.m. Francis was seen leaving his apartment above the bookstore. A neighbor, Mrs. Lillian Price, remembered spotting him locking his door as she walked. Her dog, he smiled, nodded, and said, "Morning, Lil." He seemed just fine. No rush, no worry. He was wearing his usual work clothes, worn jeans, a flannel shirt layered under a faded brown jacket. In his right hand, he carried his coffee thermos. In his left, a folded piece of paper that he slipped into his jacket pocket before heading toward his truck. No one would ever determine what was written on that paper. 8 a.m. Francis arrived at his parents' home for their regular Sunday breakfast. His mother, Margaret, would later recall that he seemed a little distracted during the meal. He kept glancing at the window, like he was expecting someone to pull up outside. I asked if something was wrong, and he just said, "No, I'm fine. Just thinking about some work I've got to finish." Still, he ate as usual, cleared his plate, and even joked with his father about a rickety chair in the dining room that Francis promised to fix next Sunday. 10:30 a.m. He left his parents' house and drove toward his workshop. 2 different people reported seeing his pickup parked outside the small warehouse-like building he rented on Mill Street. One of them, a fellow carpenter named Doug Willis, stopped in briefly to ask about borrowing a tool. He was sanding. Something seemed in good spirits. We talked for maybe 5 minutes, and then I left. That was around 11:15. 11:15 a.m. minus 12:30 p.m. This is where the first gap in the day appears. No confirmed sightings, no receipts, no phone records. The workshop was only a few minutes from the main part of town, but no one recalled seeing Francis anywhere during that window. 12:45 p.m., Francis stopped at Dalton's Diner, a small, family-run place on the corner of Main and 4th. The waitress, Carla Jenkins, remembered him well. He came in alone, sat in his usual booth, ordered a cheeseburger and coffee, paid in cash. Nothing seemed off, except he didn't stay long. Barely touched his fries. She noticed that he kept checking his watch, and at one point, his eyes drifted toward the front door every time it opened. 1:25 p.m. CCTV from a hardware store 2 blocks from the diner captured Francis walking past the storefront, heading west. He wasn't carrying any tools or purchases, just his jacket zipped up and his hands in his pockets. This would be the last confirmed visual of him on any camera. 2 p.m., 3:15 p.m. This second gap in time would later trouble investigators. It was broad daylight, a Sunday afternoon, and Francis was a familiar face in town. Yet no one could place him during these 75 minutes. 3:20 p.m., a local. Man, Harold Benton, swore he saw Francis near the old train depot, a place mostly abandoned except for a few storage sheds. He was standing by the fence, looking toward the tracks. I waved, but he didn't seem to notice me. He looked focused, like he was waiting for something. The depot was only a 10-minute walk from the diner, but Francis had no known reason to be there. 4:05 p.m., another sighting came from a teenage boy riding his bike near the river path. He claimed Francis was talking to a man in a dark coat, but couldn't describe the stranger's face. This lead was never confirmed, and the boy's account was considered unreliable due to the distance. 5 p.m. Francis should have been back at his parents' house for Sunday dinner. Instead, the Kelly family sat waiting, assuming he'd been caught up in work. At 5:30, Ellen called his workshop. No answer. At 6 o'clock, Thomas drove by the building. The truck was gone? 6:45 p.m., a passing motorist reported seeing the vehicle, matching Francis's truck, heading north out of town along Route 7. The driver seemed to be alone, but it was raining lightly by then, and visibility was poor. 7:30 p.m., Ellen tried calling his apartment. Again, no answer. It was unusual, but not yet alarming. Maybe he'd stopped to see a friend or run an errand. 8:15 p.m. By now, the rain had picked up. Francis's parents began calling friends to see if anyone had heard from him. The responses were the same. No one had seen or spoken to him since earlier that day. 9 p.m. A strange detail emerged from a man named Peter Lowe, who lived near the north edge of town. He claimed that around this time, he heard what sounded like a truck idling outside his property for several minutes before driving away. He didn't see the vehicle, but when police later asked, he was pretty sure it was a pickup by the sound of the engine. 10:15 p.m., the Kelly family contacted the police to report Francis missing. At first, officers suggested waiting until morning. After all, he was an adult, and there was no sign of foul play. But Margaret insisted this wasn't like her son. He always called if he was going to be late. Always the final hours what happened to Francis between the diner sighting and that final Uncertain report of a truck idling in the rain remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. There were no credit card charges, no phone activity, and no confirmed interactions after 1:25 p.m. It was as though he had slipped into a quiet pocket of the world that no one else could see, and then simply never returned. The next morning, his truck would be found abandoned 20 miles north of town. But on that Sunday night, as the rain fell steadily over empty streets, the Kelly family could only sit by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. The disappearance of Frances Kelly did not at first ignite the kind of frantic police activity you might expect. In those early hours, there was still a quiet assumption among some in the community, and perhaps even within the police department, that Francis would reappear on his own. People vanish for a night or two, after all. Sometimes it's by choice. But by the following morning, that calm began to unravel. His family reported that they had not heard from him, and the absence was painfully out of character. That was when the first formal steps in the investigation began. The initial police response was practical but cautious. Officers visited Francis's home, a modest, well-kept place that seemed almost frozen in time from the night before. His wallet was still sitting on the counter, keys in the bowl by the door. A jacket he often wore in the evenings hung neatly on its hook. What was missing was harder to define, a sense of movement, of interruption. The kettle still held water, as if he had been about to make tea. The blinds were drawn, the bed made. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken locks, no overturned furniture. It was as if Francis had simply stepped outside and evaporated into the night air. From there, investigators began working through the most immediate and logical questions. Who had seen Francis last? Where was he supposed to be the night he vanished? The timeline quickly became both a vital tool and a growing source of frustration. One friend told police they had seen him at around 7:30 p.m., leaving a small cafe downtown, smiling faintly as he stepped out into the chill of the evening. Another witness swore he'd spotted Francis near the bus station closer to 9 p.m., though his account wavered when pressed for details. Was Francis alone? Was he carrying anything? The man couldn't say for certain. Conflicting sightings continued to surface in those first days, each muddying the waters further. A local bartender claimed Francis had come into the pub around 8:45 p.m., ordered a pint, and left without finishing it. Another customer in the same bar remembered the interaction differently, insisting the man the bartender saw wasn't Francis at all, but someone who looked like him. Even with surveillance cameras around town, there was nothing definitive. Footage was grainy, and timestamps didn't align neatly. The police interviewed family members extensively. His sister, Margaret, described her brother as steady and dependable, not the type to vanish without explanation. She mentioned no recent arguments or financial troubles, though she admitted he'd been more withdrawn lately. His employer noted that Francis had been on time for every shift in the past year, except for the day he disappeared, when he simply failed to show up without calling in. His colleagues echoed the same sentiment. No warning signs, no erratic behavior? Evidence collection proved to be a frustrating process. The house offered no fingerprints or foreign DNA that shouldn't have been there. His phone was missing, but investigators later discovered it had been switched off at around 10 p.m. the night he vanished. Bank records showed no withdrawals, no suspicious charges. Even his email history was unremarkable, just the usual correspondence with friends, bills, and news updates. As the investigation widened, a list of potential suspects began to take shape, though most were tenuous connections at best. There was a neighbor who had argued with Francis over a property boundary years earlier, but no evidence linked him to the disappearance. There was also a former coworker who'd left the company under tense circumstances, reportedly angry with several staff members, including Francis, but police interviews found nothing concrete to suggest involvement. One of the most puzzling aspects was the sheer lack of physical evidence. Without a clear crime scene, forensic work was limited. There was no vehicle abandoned in a strange location, no discarded clothing, no signs of forced entry anywhere Francis might have gone that night. This absence forced investigators to rely heavily on human accounts, which often proved unreliable. As one detective put it at the time, every person we talk to sees him in a different place, at a different time. The more we ask, the further away the truth seems to get. Media coverage began cautiously, with local newspapers running short. Pieces urging anyone with information to come forward. Photos of Francis, always smiling in a gentle, reserved way, appeared on posters around town. In the first week, there was still a sense of hope in these appeals. But by the second month, the tone began to shift. The press started asking pointed questions about whether the police had missed early opportunities, whether they had waited too long to treat the case as potentially criminal. Public perception followed that shift. Rumors started to spread. Whispers about Francis leading a secret life, about debts or affairs that might have pulled him away. His family denied all of it, but the absence of hard facts left space for speculation to grow. Some people in town believed the police were holding back information. Others thought they had no idea where to turn next and were simply treading water. Bizarre leads trickled in, each one adding another layer of confusion. An anonymous caller claimed they had seen Francis boarding a late-night ferry, though no tickets or passenger logs supported that claim. Another tip suggested he had been spotted in a neighboring city weeks later, looking disheveled and avoiding eye contact. When investigators tracked down the man in question, it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Perhaps the strangest development came from a local shop owner who reported that a man matching Francis's description had come into her store 2 days after his disappearance and purchased a disposable rain poncho. When asked how she could be sure, she said she had served him many times before and would never forget his eyes. Yet when shown photographs, her certainty seemed to waver. As weeks turned into months, the case became a tangle of contradictions. Every promising lead unraveled. Every possible witness account conflicted with another. Detectives described it as chasing shadows, always feeling close to an answer, only to have it slip further away. Even now, years later, the official records of the investigation read like a puzzle, missing half its pieces. Francis Kelly's disappearance remains one of those haunting mysteries, where the lack of answers feels almost as deliberate as the act itself. When a person disappears without a trace, the first theory people tend to latch onto is often the simplest, the one that seems to require the fewest leaps of imagination. In Francis Kelly's case, the most mainstream explanation that took hold early on was that he had chosen to leave voluntarily. Many believe that, despite his outward stability, Francis had reached some kind of private breaking point and decided to walk away from his life. On the surface, there was a certain logic to this. Francis lived alone, had no spouse or children, and kept a relatively small circle of close friends. He wasn't tied down by a demanding job in the traditional sense. His work, though steady, wasn't the kind of career that people dream of retiring from. Those who subscribed to this theory suggested that maybe, just maybe, Francis had been quietly dissatisfied for years. They imagined he had slipped away under the cover of night, determined to start fresh somewhere far from the routines and responsibilities that had defined his life. The idea of a voluntary disappearance has its own set of motives that investigators have seen countless times before: a need to escape financial pressures, the weight of depression, or the pull of some secret relationship. People pointed out that Francis had been more withdrawn in the months leading up to his disappearance, spending more time alone, even skipping his usual pub nights with friends. To them, this behavior was a red flag, a subtle sign of preparation. Means and opportunity were certainly there. Francis had no dependents to account for, and his modest savings could have carried him at least a short distance into a new life. His missing phone could be explained by an intentional decision to cut off contact. And without anyone watching his every move, there would have been nothing to stop him from quietly boarding a late-night bus or train. Supporters of this theory often return to one particular detail: the lack of any sign of a struggle at his home. If Francis had been abducted or harmed, wouldn't there have been some trace? A broken lock, a misplaced item, an overturned chair? Instead, everything inside was neat, orderly, untouched. It looked, they say, exactly like the home of someone who had walked out on their own terms. But there's something that doesn't quite add up. If Francis truly intended to disappear, why leave his wallet and keys behind? These were not the possessions of a man planning to start over. They were the possessions of a man expecting to return. And then there's the matter of his bank account, which remained entirely unused from the day he vanished. No withdrawals, no hidden transfers, not even a purchase of a bus or train ticket that could have been traced. It was as if Francis had walked out the door without a plan for what came next, an odd choice for someone supposedly orchestrating a clean break. Then there's the emotional side of the equation. Friends and family were adamant that Francis was not the type to disappear voluntarily. His sister Margaret described him as a man of quiet consistency, someone who valued routine and reliability above almost everything else. Walking away from his life would have meant abandoning not only his home and work, but also the people he cared about. And Margaret simply could not imagine her brother doing that without a word. There's also the timing to consider. Francis had made plans for the days following his disappearance, small things, but telling ones. He had agreed to help a friend with a household repair, promised to call his niece on her birthday, and even had groceries in the fridge that suggested he'd planned to be home. People who leave voluntarily often tie up loose ends or at least show some sign of disengaging from future commitments. Francis had done neither. Skeptics of the voluntary disappearance theory point out that the withdrawal others noticed in him before he vanished might not have been preparation at all, but rather a sign of something troubling, perhaps an illness, anxiety, or another personal struggle. Instead of being the prelude to a planned departure, his quiet behavior might have been a symptom of something more complex, something that ultimately put him in harm's way. And yet, for all its flaws, this theory has remained the most popular. In casual conversation, it's clean, it's simple. It doesn't require imagining an elaborate crime or a dangerous stranger. People are often more comfortable believing that someone chose to vanish rather than believing they were taken or harmed. Voluntary disappearance allows for a small measure of hope, the idea that Francis might still be out there somewhere, living under a different name, far from the questions his absence has left behind. But the deeper you look, the more that hope begins to feel hollow. A voluntary disappearance is possible, yes, but when you start layering in the facts, the untouched bank account, the personal belongings left behind, the commitments he never broke before, the picture starts to change. What seems obvious at first begins to fray under closer scrutiny, leaving behind more questions than answers. And in Francis Kelly's case, the obvious answer may not be the right one. If the theory that Francis Kelly walked away from his life feels a little too tidy, there is another possibility that lingers in the background, one far more unsettling. It's the idea that Francis didn't leave at all, at least not by choice. Instead, something or someone intervened. This theory suggests that Francis may have been the victim of foul play, either at the hands of someone he knew or through a chance encounter with a stranger. There's no denying that the days surrounding his disappearance are frustratingly thin on concrete details. But the gaps themselves, to some, feel almost deliberate. Could it be possible that someone made sure there would be no trail to follow? One Detail that has always bothered some observers is the last confirmed sighting of Francis. A neighbor recalled seeing him outside his home that afternoon, speaking to someone in a dark-colored vehicle. The car was unfamiliar, and the neighbor couldn't recall its license plate or even its make. At the time, this didn't seem significant. Francis was a friendly man, and it wasn't unusual for him to chat with passers-by. But in the days after he vanished, that vague memory began to feel much heavier. Who was in that car? And what were they talking about? There's also the fact that Francis's home showed no signs of a break-in. This could suggest that, if someone came to his door, it was someone he trusted enough to let inside, or someone persuasive enough to convince him to step outside. Both possibilities lead to darker scenarios: a targeted confrontation, an argument that escalated, or a carefully planned abduction. Some have wondered if Francis might have been involved, however unknowingly, in something that put him at risk. He was known for helping people: neighbors, acquaintances, even the occasional stranger who asked for a favor. Could he have offered help to the wrong person? Could it be possible that he became caught up in a situation he didn't fully understand until it was too late? Adding to the unease is the almost total absence of physical evidence. Investigators found nothing in his home, yard, or surrounding area that pointed toward what happened. No discarded items, no signs of a struggle, no unusual footprints or tire marks. It's as if the space had been scrubbed clean of any trace of him leaving. That kind of absence, some argue, is suspicious in itself. And then there's the silence that followed. In many cases involving foul play, even when the perpetrator is careful, small clues begin to surface over time. A rumor, an anonymous tip, a slip in someone's story. But in Francis's case, nothing credible has emerged in decades. Not a single reliable witness has come forward claiming to have seen him after that last day. It's hard not to wonder if someone with knowledge of what happened made sure it stayed that way. Some locals have floated a theory that sits somewhere between the rational and the eerie, that Francis's disappearance was linked to a brief but strange series of events in the area during that period. Within the same month, 2 other residents reported unusual late-night knocks on their doors, only to find no one there when they looked. Another claimed to have seen a man matching Francis's description, walking along a back road at twilight, looking disoriented. Police followed up, but the report came too late to verify, and the witness couldn't be certain. It might have been nothing, a trick of memory, a coincidence, or it might have been a fleeting glimpse of Francis in the last hours before he vanished. To be clear, there's no hard evidence linking these strange incidents to Francis's case. They exist more as shadows in the background, things that make you tilt your head and say, "That's odd." But in a case already built on so many unknowns, even shadows can start to feel significant. Ultimately, this theory hinges on the belief that Francis encountered something he couldn't have anticipated, and that whatever happened afterward was enough to erase him from the public eye completely. Whether that was the result of a crime, of opportunity, a calculated act, or something more complicated is impossible to say. What we do know is that the possibility of foul play leaves a heavier mark on the imagination than the idea of voluntary disappearance. It strips away the comfort of thinking Francis might still be out there, living a different life. Instead, it replaces that thought with something colder, something harder to face, that his story may have ended not long after it left the safety of his home. And if that's the truth, the person or people responsible have carried that secret for a very long time. In the weeks following Francis Kelly's disappearance, the case moved from a state of frantic urgency to something far quieter and far more unsettling. In those first days, officers had knocked on doors, combed through fields, and spoken to anyone who might have seen him. But as each potential lead fizzled out, the tempo slowed. Search parties became smaller. Media interest waned. Eventually, the investigation settled into an uneasy limbo. One of the hardest truths about cases like this is how quickly the momentum can fade. Without fresh evidence or new witnesses, time has a way of making each unanswered question feel heavier, almost immovable. For Francis's family, those first weeks blurred into months, and the months into years. At first, they clung to the hope that he might walk back through the door, maybe with an explanation, maybe without one. But as the seasons passed, that hope began to fray. There were still moments, here and there, when it seemed like the silence might finally break. Every so often, a call would come in, someone claiming to have seen Francis in another town, or even another state. In one case, a man swore he'd spoken to him at a roadside diner hundreds of miles away. Police followed up, but the description didn't match, and the lead dissolved like so many before it. Each false alarm felt like a small wound, reopening the pain of not knowing. The frustration wasn't limited to the family. Members of the public, especially those in Francis's close-knit community, couldn't understand how a man could vanish in daylight without leaving a single trace. Many felt the investigation hadn't gone far enough, that there were avenues left unexplored. But without evidence, law enforcement's hands were tied. It's one of the cruel paradoxes of missing persons cases. You need evidence to keep a case alive, but you often need a living case to find the evidence. There were moments when it seemed the case might stir again. An anonymous letter once arrived at the local police station, claiming to know what happened to the man who vanished on Willow Street. The letter offered no specifics, no names, no dates, just a cryptic promise that truth comes with patience. It was postmarked from a nearby town, but handwriting analysis and interviews led nowhere. Whether it was a cruel prank or a genuine but guarded attempt to share information, no one could say. And yet, for all the dead ends, the file on Francis Kelly was never officially closed. Investigators kept it in the open drawer, even if it gathered more dust than new evidence. Occasionally, a new detective would take it down, read through the notes, and see if there was some angle that had been missed. So far, every attempt has ended in the same place, with more questions than answers. Today, the case stands as a reminder of how fragile certainty can be. One moment, a man is living his life, talking with neighbors, going about his routines, and the next he is gone, leaving only an echo behind. The trail hasn't just gone cold. It has all but disappeared, leaving no clear direction to follow. But for those who knew Francis, and for those who still wonder about his fate, the story isn't entirely over. All it would take is one piece of information, one witness stepping forward, one overlooked clue to bring the truth into the light. Until then, his disappearance remains suspended between possibility and silence, in that quiet, haunting space where so many unsolved mysteries live. Thank you for joining me in revisiting the story of Francis Kelly, a case that, even after all these years, continues to echo with unanswered questions. If you've heard of this case before, or if you know of other details that might not be widely discussed, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. These quiet, haunting investigations matter because they keep forgotten stories alive, and sometimes that attention is enough to bring new light to the shadows. If you'd like to hear more cases like this, unsolved mysteries, strange disappearances, and stories that history has almost let slip away, consider subscribing. Your support helps ensure that these stories are not forgotten. Until next time, stay safe and keep listening to the whispers of the past.